Good afternoon, everyone. I declare open the Legislative Council Legal and Social Issues Committee's public hearing into the closure of I Cook Foods. May I first begin by respectfully acknowledging the Aboriginal peoples of the traditional custodians of the many lands that we're meeting on today, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and particularly to any First Nations people who are joining us today or who are watching us, watching these proceedings. In fact, I'd like to welcome everyone who is joining us via the internet to watch these proceedings. My name is Fiona Patton. I'm the chair of this committee. I'm joined today by Dr. Tien Q, the deputy chair, Mr. Craig Ondarchi, Ms. Kushalia Vagela, Ms. Georgie Crozier, Ms. Sheena Watt, Mr. David Limbrick, Dr. Matthew Bark, Ms. Wendy Lovell. Thank you. And we're very happy that Ms. Woodstock and Ms. Worry could join us. They are Mrs. Painter's daughters. Just to let both of you know that all evidence taken today is protected by parliamentary privilege, and this is provided under our Constitution Act, but also the standing orders of the Legislative Council. Therefore, any information that you provide during this hearing is protected by law. You're protected against any action for what you say during this hearing. But if you go elsewhere and repeat the same things, those comments may not be protected. Any deliberately false evidence or misleading of the committee may be considered a contempt of Parliament. We're recording today, and Hansard will provide you with a transcript of today next week, and I'd encourage you to have a look at that. Make sure that we didn't misunderstand you or misrepresent anything that you've said today. If you would like to make some opening remarks, and then we'll open it up to committee discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Chair, committee members, we would like to thank this inquiry for the opportunity to provide input into this matter, which for us is very important in trying to get some closure and understanding as to the reasons for the death of our mother. Ironically, today would have been her 89th birthday. I am the second daughter of Jean Painter, and I, like most sisters, believe that my mother needs to be represented and have a voice in this very distressing matter, which has been played out in what appears to us as a deliberate media campaign since this all evolved. There has been no input sought nor provided from the members of her family, myself and my sisters and our extended family in any investigation, whether via this inquiry or the Victoria Police. We appreciate that the privacy and respect shown to us in the early stages of the investigations may explain the fact we would never have been approached to contribute to any investigations to this point in time. However, given the very public discussion that her death has now taken, we believe it is now time to speak up and try and set the record straight. The evidence that we can provide challenges many of the falsehoods and incorrect information and assertions that has driven much of the discourse in the public arena about who our mother was, what she ate, and how she died. To the world, we say, draw your own conclusions, but do not dismiss us. I ask a question. Has anyone thought to ask us what we saw and what we witnessed? We can provide information of several instances that we personally witnessed our mother eating food whilst a patient at the Knox Private Hospital. This includes the consumption of sandwiches on 4 occasions, one of which I personally witnessed, and that was on the 23rd of January in the emergency department after being discharged to Don Vale Rehabilitation Hospital and then sent back for readmission to Knox within 2 hours as she was so unwell and not suitable for admission to the rehabilitation centre. During her readmission to Knox, she ate packaged sandwiches given to her in the emergency department, which she ate and made comments to me where she said, "Oh, these don't taste very nice," as she ate the sandwiches. My sister Fiona also witnessed her eating sandwiches on at least 2 other occasions, as well as other meals chosen from the standard hospital menu. My eldest son can also recall an occasion of her eating sandwiches during one of his visits to see her during her time in hospital, which equates to 4 occasions. I wish to start by getting some facts clear. Our mother lived independently in a retirement village in Doncaster. She wasn't in an aged care facility and did not require care nor assistance. She enjoyed reasonable health, indicating to us some 6 months prior to her death that she was going to be around for at least another 5 years, as she was feeling pretty good about her health and life in general. She was totally ambulant, albeit a little wobbly on her feet from time to time. She was a very social lady. She was also a fighter, having beaten breast cancer twice, some 30 years before her untimely death. She was admitted to Knox Private Hospital on the 13th of January to try and work out why she'd been having issues with her stomach and losing weight. She was admitted on 13th of January, underwent several tests and procedures, and she was diagnosed with gastric ulcers during her early days in hospital. From her admission date up until her deterioration on or about the 24th of January, she was conscious and ate normal hospital food, including sandwiches on several occasions, which she both enjoyed, and on one occasion she did not. As previously stated, her consumption of these sandwiches was witnessed by myself, my sister Fiona, and my eldest son, and at no stage between these dates was she placed on a soft food diet. The soft food diet did not commence until she had been diagnosed with listeria, which was on or about the 25th of January. The diet was given because her state of consciousness became a thing of change from that date, and the fear of her choking became the driving force for this diet change. On many occasions, she lapsed from being conscious in our minds to being unconscious. Her deterioration was one of the most distressing things to witness, as it progressed to what we were informed became a meningitis-related condition caused by the listeria. She was clearly in great pain, and we witnessed her groaning on numerous occasions in what were described to us as primal groans during her periods of what we considered to be unconsciousness. This was largely how things remained until her death, despite a few short instances of pain consciousness. The treating infectious diseases doctor gave us encouragement during this period that he was confident that she would recover. Sadly, however, her health deterioration continued as a rollercoaster ride for us, and was something that no person would ever wish to experience nor witness. This has been the most distressing and agonising experience we ever had to endure, and the visions of her suffering will always haunt us. By way of experience and assistance to myself, my husband, who was a respected member of Victoria Police for 43 years prior to his retirement earlier this year, told me that he's dealt with many deaths and people in pain and dying over his time in the force, and that this was one of the worst deaths that he has ever seen, given the pain she was going through. It was just horrible. He, like myself and my 2 sisters and my brother-in-law, Steve, were present when she died. Although my husband did not personally witness my mother eating sandwiches during her stay, he was certainly aware that she was consuming food at Knox Private Hospital while she was fully conscious and aware of her ability to make decisions, and was present with me when she was filling out her food menu requests on several occasions from the 13th of January until her listeria diagnosis. He visited her on numerous occasions during this period and would be more than happy to give evidence to this inquiry if warranted. We have followed most of this discourse in the media and the parliamentary inquiry about this matter and listened to the most to most of the hearings and read all the transcripts from the initial parliamentary inquiry. Given what has now played out in the media since this time, we believe it is now time to speak up and to provide some direct evidence of what we saw, what we experienced. We have no interest in conspiracy theories nor political motivations about the decisions taken by any parties in this matter, either real or perceived. We just want the facts presented to the inquiry to be correct and the truth and to be put into the public arena. In our view, the evidence given by Professor Brett Sutton in the original inquiry was, for us, the most balanced and accurate account and summary that explains what occurred leading up to and including the death of our mother. We took great comfort from his original appearance because his evidence explained to us what happened, how it happened, and largely why it happened. We have great faith in our health system, and we hope that the findings of this inquiry will be based on factual evidence, the rule of law, and the principles of justice. We have provided the committee with 3 documents that might assist in establishing who our mother was, why she died, and despite the best efforts, how things can go wrong when due care is not taken. These include copies of some promotional features that she appeared in promoting AVIO, where she resided in the Domain Retirement Village, a copy of a death certificate, which clearly lists listeria as a primary cause of her death, and a copy of a mass-produced letter from a mail out from Knox Private Hospital advising former patients of a listeria outbreak and what should you do if you develop symptoms. Incredibly, this letter was personally addressed and posted to our mother some 18 days after her death. We believe that our mother's death and the resultant fast and immediate actions taken by DHHS following her death were appropriate and possibly saved the lives of others. To this, we say thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Woodstock and Ms. Worry. And I appreciate you actually supplying us with a photo of your mother. That was really lovely to see.
Well, just to put a face.
I know. I so appreciated that. We've only got a very short time to get together. Could I just confirm that your mother, when she first came to the hospital, was not on a soft diet, and also on the 23rd, when she was in the emergency room, she was given a packet of some packaged sandwiches, and those were the ones she said, "Oh, I don't like the taste of them."
Yeah, so both myself and my sister Fiona saw her eat them, and she didn't eat the whole packet because she said they didn't taste nice. No. So, and we've got dates of witnessing her eating sandwiches.
So it was when she became very ill that they put her onto the soft diet?
Yes, once she became, her conscious state altered, and that was on or about the 25th of January, and she was diagnosed with listeria then. And there was a fear of choking because of her consciousness.
Of course. Thank you. I'll move to Deputy Chair Tien Kiew.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms. Woodstock and Worry, for appearing in front of the committee today to share your story and to assist us. And we do appreciate the distress that you are going through on the publicity and allegation and the very difficult nature of the inquiry. Once again, you have submitted to the committee the death certificate and also the letter from Healthscope linking listeria to your mother's death. So, and you, in your own words, you said that what have been action been taken by the Department of Health and the local city councils, local governments, were balanced and also appropriate. So, in your opinion, you think that business that provide food for healthcare settings and vulnerable cohort should continue to be operating if there is some linkage of listeria, particularly to a death, and or should they be expected of higher standards?
I totally agree. Yeah, they should not be operating if there's linkage with this listeria, and they should be operating at the most highest of standards they're delivering food to vulnerable people. Yes, and you would expect they have the highest standards.
Well, thank you. And once again, our condolences to your family,
Thank
particularly on her would have been 89th birthday.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Crozier.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Ms. Woodstock and Ms. Worry, for appearing before the inquiry. And again, a difficult day in terms of the anniversary of your mother's birthday. So thank you. I've got a couple of questions, if I may. On the 13th of January, it's my understanding from the previous evidence that we received last year that your mother was admitted to Knox Hospital with gastritis and colitis. Is that correct?
Fee?
Yes, it was.
Yeah, so that is very severe. Gastritis is obviously very painful. Colitis is diarrhea. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah, so they are symptoms of food poisoning. But did your mum have blood tests taken at that point when she was admitted on the 13th of January?
She had blood tests the following day.
Any blood cultures when she was admitted on the 13th of January?
She had, let me refer, she had a CT bowel scan. She was on antibiotics. Blood tests, I'm not sure whether it was blood cultures.
Okay. And did you request an inquest into your mum's death?
No, we didn't, because we knew that she died from, as what the infectious diseases doctor stated, it was listeria, and the treating doctors were, felt there was no need to have an autopsy or inquest.
But sorry, I just need to ask that again. So the medical certificate, it was the primary, it's my understanding that the primary cause of death was not listeriosis, it was an underlying condition. Could you just repeat what you said about the doctor saying it wasn't necessary to hold an inquest? Did I hear that correctly?
It wasn't necessary to have an autopsy.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't considered because we all knew that she died from listeria, as stated by the infectious diseases doctor at Knox Private, and the treating doctors that signed the death certificates accordingly.
And
she'd had the heart condition for well over 15 years. So
yeah, that's right. That's my understanding too. So she
Georgie, your time is.
So just one thing, sorry, just acute pulmonary edema, ischemic heart disease, and listeria. So that in those orders from the medical certificate. One other thing, did you FOI the Department of Health and Human Services on your mother's death?
They contacted us.
Yes.
Why?
Because there was a media release. And they also contacted us once she was diagnosed with listeria, which, because it's a reportable disease, as you'd be aware. So then they contacted my sister Fiona, advising us that there would be a media release.
On what date?
Thank you. Georgie, I'm sorry. Mr. Limbrick.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ms. Woodstock and Worry, for appearing today. I can't imagine how difficult this whole experience must be for you. Just one question. Listeriosis, my understanding is it has quite a long incubation time. Were you asked by the Department of Health for like a full food history of what your mother ate?
Yes.
Yeah, and so when did that occur? So they had information on all of the food that she'd eaten over a period of how long?
Yes, and it was a period of approximately 2 weeks prior to her admission.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vergela.
Could I just also say, sorry,
Yes.
on admission she was diagnosed with gastroenteritis, just to get that clear.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Worry. Ms. Vergela.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Mrs. Woodstock and Ms. Worry, for coming today and sharing your story with us. It will certainly shed a light and will assist us in this inquiry. I'm really sorry to hear about the death of your mother, and particularly under the circumstances it happened. My thoughts are with you and all your family members. The question I have is there anything that the committee could have done during the inquiries of over the past year and a half to improve the experience your family has had to go through?
That's a good question. I just think the way it's been, we all feel the way that it's been played out in the media has been extremely distressing. And even yesterday, there's a truck going around with take a selfie with the slug, you know, it just absolute this. We were all lost for words, just couldn't believe what we were seeing. So, yeah, it's just the way it's been played out in the media. Maybe we could have been contacted for our information, but now we've been given the opportunity, and we thank the committee for that.
So just a quick one, Chair. At what point you guys thought that I think we need to go and give information? What led you to that decision?
When the second inquiry, when it was reopened, then we thought this is now we've got to. We did, you know, the first parliamentary inquiry. We listened and took it in, and as I said, you know, we're really pleased with Professor Sutton's comments and findings. And then when it was reopened, we thought, now we have to stand up and give our mother a voice, because we don't want this to happen to anybody else.
Thank you. Thank you. My sympathies are with you on this bittersweet day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Lovell.
Thank you, Fiona. If I could just extend my condolences to the family. The loss of any parent and much loved parent, a very difficult time for the family. But I'm going to concede my time to Ms. Crozier as she was unable to continue with her line of questioning.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you again for providing this information. It is important that we get to the bottom of this issue, and I know it is difficult. Distressing. There's a letter we've received from Healthscope dated the 22nd of February 2019 that was addressed to your mum.
Yes.
Sadly. Yes. So in that letter it says, listeria symptoms can appear anywhere between 3 and 70 days post-exposure and can include fever, headache, tiredness, aches and pain, nausea and diarrhoea. They were as your Ms. Worry said, your mum was admitted on the 13th of January with gastroenteritis, which obviously, as we understood in the previous inquiry, some of those symptoms of gastric pain, nausea, vomiting, diarrhoea are very much part of gastroenteritis. So could there be a situation in your mind that your mum came in unknowingly to being unwell, having those symptoms, or had she expressed to you maybe that she had got gastroenteritis from some other means?
No, and also her GP felt that she was over the worst of it, and we thought, and along with her GP felt it was because she was losing weight, to go to hospital to get her built up again, and looked after. So, you go to hospital to get well, not to get sick.
But sorry to cut across you, Ms. Woods, but she did present at the time, as you said, she was admitted with gastroenteritis, which...
gastric ulcers.
But Ms. Worry, your sister said gastroenteritis, which is diarrhoea, vomiting, nausea, and in addition to gastric ulcers.
Yeah.
So she would have been very unwell.
Yeah. But as I said, the GP said she was over the worst of it. So...
the GP had diagnosed her a day prior to admission with gastroenteritis.
Yes.
Then once she was admitted to Knox Private with the scans, etc., she then was diagnosed with gastric ulcers. 3 days prior to her admission, she hadn't eaten, and the health department had taken a full listing of previous places where she ate and what she ate, and that was investigated.
Have you got a
Thank
list?
you. I'm sorry, Ms. Crozier. Ms. Watt.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms. Woodstock and Ms. Worry, for being with us today on what is a sad day for your family, and can I extend to you my sympathies. I just had a question about, as a family, what was your expectation of the food that was supplied to your mum in these health settings?
A balanced diet, certainly with safe products. Yeah.
And do you have any thoughts on the standards that should be kept at the food manufacturing centres where the food is made for clients of hospitals? If there is a higher standard, do you think that there should be a higher standard for the food production, quality and sanitation at these places that make food for vulnerable clients?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I absolutely agree, because in hospitals, a lot of people are vulnerable. So the standards need to be high.
That's really all I had
Thank you.
for today. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ondarchi.
Thank you, Ms. Woodstock, Ms. Worry. It's very brave of you today to come in and do
Thank
this,
you.
given how tough it is. I do understand. Were Knox Hospital supportive of you after your mother's passing?
No.
Okay. And do we know, I don't know, but do you know, did anybody else catch listeria at Knox Hospital about the same time as your mum?
We're unaware of. I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Figella.
Thanks, Chair. Either Mrs. Woodstock or Ms. Worry can answer. As far as this inquiry went, what lessons would you like to be learned from your family's experience?
Jo?
I would like that businesses that prepare food for anybody, doesn't matter if they're vulnerable or not, is of the highest quality and standards, and all the strict regulations are adhered to, and so that no one gets sick. And that's, you know, whether they're selling it to cafes or selling it to, or providing it for hospitals, it must be of the highest standard, because when you eat food, you don't expect to get sick.
And so I just want to confirm once again. So if we did not have this second inquiry, the reopen inquiry, you would have never come forward to provide us the information that you have provided today, and we would have never known then?
Well, no. But this has given us the voice and Mum the voice, and we thank the committee for that opportunity. And that's where we've sat back and watched the media circus, shall I call it, being played out.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And that's really hit home the impact that, you know, that the media and around this has had on your family. I think, did your mother came straight from Doncaster, from the Aveo, from her home to the hospital. Do you know if anyone at her home had fallen sick, or if there had been any sort of gastro outbreaks or anything like that at Aveo?
No. It's a retirement village.
Yeah.
They live independently. In their
Of course,
own.
they're cooking their own. They're not eating.
Yes.
They're not eating communally. Yes, of course. Thank you. Ms. Watt.
I just had a question for you both about support from anyone when it comes to preparing for today, and were you offered any support and assistance? I understand this can be a very distressing thing, and is there any lessons that you'd like to share for us about support for grieving families as they present evidence in inquiries like this?
Well, we've been supporting each other. All of our husbands have been fantastic. Also, we all are have sought professional help, and that has been a great support for us.
We haven't received any support from other sources to answer part of your question.
Well, it's certainly something for us to consider. No, thank you.
Yeah, but the contact we've had with the inquiry staff has been very good, very supportive. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. They are a good bunch.
Yeah.
Dr. Bark.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you to you both for being with us, and my condolences to you as well. I might pick up where Ms. Watt has left off, and also touching on the question that Ms. Ondarchi asked, because undoubtedly we, in these inquiries, in government departments, other entities can do far better to support people who find themselves in positions such as yours. You said in response to Ms. Ondarchi's question that you didn't receive any support from Knox Hospital. Would you mind just explaining in a little bit more detail what that looked like? I think you said you felt unsupported. I certainly don't want to put words in your mouth by Knox Hospital. What did that look like as a learning exercise for us?
Well, they didn't offer any support. She died there. That was the end of story. And then, as I said, 18 days after her death, we get a letter from them. So they offered no support at all. So
okay. And then just quickly, again, linking back, I think, to the very good question that Ms. Watt asked you, you also didn't receive any support, any contact from the Department of Health or any figures in the government. Is that right?
Yeah, they contacted Fiona.
So they contacted me initially for to the reporting the listeria and getting the information that they required. And on one other occasion, which was perhaps whether it was a week to 2 weeks later, I can't recall. Sorry, I actually rang them and asked what was going on, any updates, just asking for some information, and they said that they were unable to provide any information at this stage, and that was it.
All right. Thank you both very much. It's just very useful. Thank you.
Just one thing which might help us maybe in future, if people are being mentioned in inquiries, maybe ask the family, would they like to participate? And yeah, that's just one thing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Q.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. I'd just like to mention that we did consider the question of whether inviting you for the first inquiry, but our respect and it's so raw. So once again, I'd like to say that this is difficult, but I would like to recall what the witness, Mr. Christie, last week as the environmental health officer, as in answering to my own question and many others, that there was no hard, or the only diet was a soft diet for the entire length of the stay in the hospital. So what did you make of that? And that was based, according to Mr. Christie's evidence, based on the confirmation of the chef or the manager in the kitchen. So what did you make of that?
It's absolutely incorrect. That she was not placed on a soft food diet until about the 24th, 25th of January. And also they put a sign above her bed saying that, that the risk of aspiration. So I don't know.
That was on the 25th of January.
Yeah, and I don't know how the kitchen manager at Knox Private Hospital, seeing that the records are not kept of patients' food orders, or I don't know how he could make that assumption or claim.
Thank you.
The dietitians, surely the dietitians would have information as well about her being on a full ward diet.
And we helped her fill out menus, and she filled out menus independently from the full hospital menu. No, not a soft food diet.
Okay. Thank
you. Thank you so much.
you. Mr. Limbrick.
Thank you, Chair. This letter that you've submitted, the letter from Healthscope, which remarkably was addressed to your mother, is it your understanding that this letter was sent to all of the patients that were in the hospital during that period, and they all received this letter?
I understand. Yeah, that's what I understand, because I presume that it was a mail out. Yes, a general mail out.
Yes. Okay. And the timeliness of this, it seems like a very long time after the fact to get that. Was that sort of surprising to you that it took such a long time before you got this sort of information?
Absolutely. And we couldn't believe that it was addressed to Mum, and 18 days after she died. We just couldn't. And this is where, if due care is not taken, and as I said in the statement, if due care is not taken, mistakes can be made.
And yeah, okay. And when you're talking about due care here, you're talking about the hospital itself, like, or
well, we're sending it, just sending out a letter to someone that is deceased, and this, yeah.
I understand. Thank you.
Thank you to both of you very much today. And, I think possibly in retrospect, we should have contacted you. And I wonder why more people, why the department and others have not also been in greater contact with you last year. But thank you so much for today. I hope that, I hope in some ways that it's helped you, because you've been able to speak really fully and really provide a voice for your mother. So thank you again on behalf of all of us for appearing today. You'll receive a transcript of today's hearing. As I mentioned, please have a look at it and make sure that we haven't misrepresented or misheard you in any way. Thanks, everyone.
Opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll just take a quick reset for the next witnesses. Thank you, everyone. Welcome back. I'm very pleased that we are now joined by Professor Brett Sutton, Dr. Angie Bone, the Deputy Cho, Mr. Greg Stenton, the Deputy Secretary of Corporate Affairs, Mr. Paul Goldsmith, Ms. Pauline Maloney, and Ms. Sally Atkinson, all from the Department of Health. Thank you again for joining us. I'm joined here, I'm Fiona Patton, the Chair of the Committee. I'm joined by Dr. Tien Q, the Deputy Chair, Mr. Craig Ondaatje, Ms. Kshalia Vagela, Mr. David Limbrick, Ms. Wendy Lovell, Ms. Sheena Watt, Ms. Georgie Crozier, and Dr. Matthew Bark. People swishing around on my screen. If I could just also advise that all evidence taken is protected by parliamentary privilege as provided by the Constitution Act and further subject to the provisions of the Legislative Council standing orders. Therefore, any information that you provide here today is protected by law during this hearing. You're protected against any actions for what you say here. But if you go elsewhere and repeat the same things, those comments may not be protected. Any deliberately false evidence or misleading of the committee may be considered a contempt of Parliament. As you'd be aware, all the evidence is being recorded by our Hansard team, and you will be provided with a transcript of today's hearing. I'd encourage you to look at it, make sure that we haven't misrepresented you or misheard you. Ultimately, that will form part of our report and be made public on our website. I understand there's an opening statement that will be around 10 minutes, and Professor Sutton, if you'd like to open.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, committee members, for the opportunity to speak. You've heard who I'll be joined by, so I won't reintroduce them. I would like to also acknowledge Mrs. Painter's next of kin and provide my condolences as well. I understand the purpose of the reopening of this inquiry is to deal with a matter not specifically addressed when the inquiry first sat, namely the emails from Mr. Ray Christie of Knox City Council to the department on the 22nd of February 2019, which suggested that the patient was on a soft diet and the impact this has on testimony previously provided to this inquiry. First, I'd like to start by saying that, save for one specific matter for correction, which I'll address in a moment, I stand by the testimony previously provided to this inquiry. As such, I won't readdress the inquiry on the matters subject to that previous testimony, and will focus on the additional information related to the Ray Christie emails. With respect to these emails, I'd like to address two primary points. Firstly, these emails post-date the making of the closure order and were therefore clearly not something that I could have taken into account, and obviously didn't take into account in the making of the closure order. And secondly, even if these emails had been brought to my attention at the time or shortly thereafter, they would not have changed my decision to issue the closure order. The first point's a simple one. I issued the closure order on iCook Foods under the powers of the Food Act that had been delegated to me by the Secretary to the Department in the evening of 21 February 2019. This closure order was served on iCook Foods at their premises at 4 a.m. on the 22nd of February 2019, prior to morning production commencing at 4:30. Mr. Christie's first email to the department, which has recently been brought to my attention, was sent at 10:34 a.m. That same morning. A subsequent email was sent by Mr. Christie at 12:41 that day. As such, clearly Mr. Christie's emails, even if they'd been relevant and provided to me, which I'll get to in a second, were not something I could have taken into account at the time of making that decision to issue the closure order. Nor should I add, do I think it was a critical input that I should have waited for before being in a position to make a decision on the closure order, given all the information provided to me indicating that there was an immediate risk to public health arising from food produced by iCook Foods. Secondly, I wish to address the relevance of the Christie emails and the bearing it would have had if it had come to my attention. I should point out that Christie emails were considered and appropriately addressed by the relevant teams and therefore were never escalated to me. I'll allow Dr. Bone to address that in a moment. As I've discussed previously with this inquiry, at the time of making the closure order, the following matters were known to me based on oral and written information provided by several authorised officers over a number of days prior to that order. First, after the department was notified of the case of listeriosis confirmed by blood culture, the department conducted interviews with her next of kin, and as you've heard, and the treating doctor to obtain the food history for the 4 weeks prior to the onset of her listeria infection, including information on the patient's food selection whilst in hospital. This investigation included email advice from the principal infection control consultant at the Knox Private Hospital that the patient was on a full ward diet. Food served at the hospital was provided by iCook Foods, and any food items that are recognised as high risk for listeria were supplied through iCook. I understand that a copy of this email has been provided to the inquiry. I would like at this juncture to point out that when I previously addressed the inquiry, I erroneously referred to iCook being Knox Private Hospital's sole caterer. This is what was initially understood and had been told to me. I've since been informed that subsequent information provided by Mr. Christie indicated that this was incorrect, and I do apologise for any confusion caused. Of relevance, items identified in the food history as being consumed by the patient while in hospital were sandwiches, and it was known that iCook Foods provided the hospital with sandwiches for those on a full ward diet, as well as providing a range of other foods. For the purposes of this investigation, nothing turned on whether iCook Foods was or was not the sole caterer for the hospital. Second, the department asked Manningham Council and the City of Greater Dandenong to take food samples and environmental swabs for testing from multiple sources in order to cast a wide net to try and capture all the potential sources of infection. Results for food and environmental samples from Coles, Woolworths, Mirabella Brothers and Avio Domain Retirement Village were all negative for listeria. However, at the time of issuing the closure order, listeria species had been detected in 7 foods sampled at iCook Foods premises. 6 of these had grown Listeria monocytogenes, the organism responsible for invasive listeriosis, and 4 of these had grown Listeria monocytogenes that had the same molecular serotype and the same binary type as that found in the patient. It was later shown that Listeria isolated from these 4 foods had exactly the same genetic sequence or fingerprint, if you like, as each other, and that it was a very close match to the strain found in the patient, providing strong evidence of a link between iCook Foods and the patient. Indeed, this strain of Listeria with this particular genetic sequence has not been matched to any other isolates in Australia before or after this event. So there's really no other reasonable explanation that the source of the patient's infection was anything other than iCook Foods. Third, reports from senior environmental health officers in City of Greater Dandenong stated that iCook Food staff, including the food safety supervisors, had little understanding of food safety practices and that the food safety program was inadequate for the scope and scale of production, and that these deficiencies were subsequently confirmed when the department's authorised officers visited the iCook premises on the day after the closure order was issued to determine what specific remediations were required before I could lift or revoke that closure order. And fourth, the City of Greater Dandenong advised the department that iCook Foods supplied 10 Melbourne hospitals, 8 council Meals on Wheels programs and 2 aged care facilities. I was informed that iCook Foods prepared approximately 7,000 meals per week. It should be assumed that in all of those particular settings that vulnerable patients and residents make up the vast majority, if not everyone, in those settings. That indicated to me that there was potentially a large number of individuals who could be exposed to Listeria and that this could be a very significant public health risk because the infection could be invasive, infecting the blood and or brain in those most vulnerable, causing serious illness and death. If there were ongoing exposure to contaminated foods and subsequent infections, then further serious illness and or deaths were a strong possibility. As I've stated previously, there was no single piece of information that I used in isolation to come to the decision of the closure. It was on the basis of that collective picture. In light of this, the emails from Knox City Council suggesting that the patient was on a soft diet for 1 or more days, and we've heard which admission it appears to apply to, would not have in and of itself impacted my decision on the closure order. The information supplied by Mr. Christie that the patient was on a soft diet contradicted the advice obtained by the department directly from a member of the infection control team at Knox Private Hospital with respect to that first admission, after conferring with the ward's menu monitor, who confirmed the patient was on a full ward diet for the period 13 January to 23 January 2019. That is just prior to her being diagnosed with listeriosis. Even if the patient may have been on a soft diet for 1 or more days in that time, the overwhelming evidence of the presence of Listeria in iCook food samples, that being so closely related to that from the patient, would suggest that she'd come into contact with food originating from iCook Foods, regardless of other potential diets during her days in hospital. In any case, by the evening of 21 February, when I issued the closure order, it was clear that investigations of iCook Food had identified the presence of Listeria monocytogenes at their premises and inadequacies in their food safety practices and their food program. That was the information available to me for my judgment, and given these concerns, regardless of the potential days of soft diet and other suppliers, I would have considered it appropriate to issue the closure order to ensure that these matters were addressed before iCook could resume producing food for vulnerable people in the community. I'll allow Dr. Bone to continue. Thank you.
Dr. Bone, I'm just very conscious of time. You've got about 4 minutes. So I don't know if you and Mr. Stenton want to divide that, or if Mr. Stenton might like to answer the questions fully and respond and give his statements later in the day. Dr. Bone.
Unmute, Angie.
Do apologise. Thank you. So yes, thank you, everybody. I will go as quickly as I possibly can, but I think I have some key information that is important for you to hear. So really, I'm going to address the inquiry on the investigations undertaken to determine the source of Listeria infection in the patient, particularly in light of those emails from Mr. Christie on the 22nd of February. I won't reiterate how important Listeria monocytogenes is for public health, or how some of those investigations can be quite challenging, but I do want to emphasise that our main aim is to prevent or limit any ongoing risk to public health, and that is achieved by acting in a timely manner to identify risk and then try and remove it. From the department's perspective, the process undertaken to investigate the source of Listeria infection in this patient was conducted in the usual manner and followed usual processes following notification of a listeriosis case. I understand Mr. Christie spoke to the inquiry about the specific procedure followed for a single case of gastroenteritis. I should pause here to make it clear to the inquiry that this was a case of listeriosis and not a single gastroenteritis case, and also be clear that the two situations are managed very differently. So gastroenteritis refers to inflammation of the lining of the stomach or intestines and can be caused by things like Salmonella or Campylobacter. Whilst we know that Listeria monocytogenes occasionally causes a diarrhea, that's not the main symptom, and it's not often observed. It's usually a septicemia. Gastroenteritis cases are about 100 times more common, probably more than listeriosis. And the investigation of a single gastroenteritis case is usually much more straightforward. There's a shorter incubation period for pathogens, and it's much easier to get a food history in that situation. As such, single cases of gastroenteritis are usually referred to by the department to counsel, to interview the patient in question and follow up any risk factors. In order to do that, counsels are provided with the case's personal details. However, in cases of listeriosis, such as this one, the patient and their next of kin are interviewed by the department, and it would not be usual for us to pass details on to the counsel. Victoria's guidelines for the investigation of gastroenteritis are available on our website, and they set out the various actions expected of councils. They clearly state that listeriosis cases are not referred to local government, but investigated by department officers who may request assistance from local government for specific tasks.
I'm sorry to cut you off, Dr. Bone. It's just we do have a short period of time. No doubt we will explore more of the information that you have to provide, and the same, Mr. Stenton, no doubt we'll do that. If I could start, given the numbers that you spoke about, Professor Sutton, of the variety of locations, the possible 7,000 meals that were coming out of iCook Food, is it surprising that there only appears to have been one case of listeriosis, and even there didn't seem to be any other, there was no other recorded cases at Knox Private Hospital as well?
Thank you, Chair. I do recall addressing this in the original inquiry. There are a number of steps that you need to go through in order to have a confirmed case of listeriosis, invasive listeriosis. There will be a number of people who consume potentially contaminated food or indeed contaminated food who don't become unwell. There are a proportion who may have a milder illness, and diarrheal illness is another potential consequence. If they provide a fecal specimen to their GP or to an emergency department, and there's a specific request for listeria to be looked for, then a diagnosis might come from that gastrointestinal illness. Invasive listeria is either an infection of the bloodstream or infection of the lining and substance of the brain. Clearly, that's a much more serious illness. There would be tests done for those individuals, but you need a blood culture in order to identify it in someone who's got a fever, and you would need a lumbar puncture or some other diagnosis based on CAT scan or MRI scan, for example, that would support meningitis. The reality is not everyone is vulnerable to invasive listeriosis. There may well have been a number of people who were exposed to contaminated food who had a milder illness who never got diagnosed, and there may well have been a number of people who would have become unwell and had serious illness if that closure order had not occurred.
You don't know that. You don't
Excuse
know
me,
that.
Mr. Ondaatje, please. Thank you, Professor Sutton. Yes, I appreciate that. Just turning to Mr. Christie's emails, which really was part of the reason that we reopened this inquiry, and I have to say, personally, I was quite surprised reading that, from Mr. Christie's emails that the patient had been on a soft diet the whole time and therefore could not have consumed sandwiches provided by iCook Foods. Did you or Mr. Goldsmith, who was, I believe, Mr. Goldsmith, these emails were addressed to you, were you surprised by his findings? Was this something that caused you to go back and review what information you had?
For myself, Chair, I've only become aware of these emails very recently, so they weren't provided to me at or around the time of the closure order. So I'll allow Angie or Paul to speak to how they considered that information.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that question. So we discussed the Christie emails at our incident management team on the 22nd of February. So the kind of the day after the very early morning when the closure order was issued. We considered them, but we also compared them with the other information that we had. So we saw that he had said that it was more than likely, first of all, and then it was confirmed. But his information wasn't specific to the time period and didn't say who had given him that information. And we had this whole host of other evidence from our discussions with the infection control nurse and from the discharge summary, all of which stated that the lady was on a full ward diet. And of course, we had the information from the City of Greater Dandenong about concerns about food safety programs and practices, and we had the strongest evidence, which was the typing link and the genetic link between the listeria in the case and the foods at iCook Foods. So in the end, we just decided that the information wasn't as credible as the other information that we had.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Bone. Thank you, Professor Sutton. Dr. Hugh.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all from the department for appearing today and also for providing us with the chain of email about the diet, food diet, ward diet. I may have a question for Professor Sutton. First of all, thank you very much for appearing. I know that you're very busy with the situation at hand in Victoria and in Australia. My question is, I just go back to what you said for the previous hearing. Quote, no one single piece of information was used in isolation to come to that decision, namely the closure of iCook Foods. Rather, it was the collective picture of public health risk that I believe iCook Foods, continuing food production represented, unquoted. So my question is, now in your opening statement, you have presented several pieces of evidence leading to your decision and also the issuing under the delegated power under the Food Act. Was there any single evidence that most strongly influenced you in coming to that decision?
The really key ones are both the epidemiological link through the food history that iCook Foods supplied Knox Hospital and that the patient ate foods in Knox Hospital that were described as the normal ward diet, which iCook supplied foods for. That was one key piece. Of equal and maybe even greater importance was that genetic fingerprint or the genetic typing of the Listeria monocytogenes, which, as I say, was identical across food types within the iCook Foods kitchen and very, very closely related to the sample from the patient. And that was closer than any other food or environmental sample taken from across Australia for some years prior to that time and for years subsequent. So those two pieces of information in particular really linked the plausible exposure to contaminated food and showed that genetic link, that we do in the same way for COVID diagnosis to understand where it's come from, but also understand, for example, whether someone's been exposed to that infectious agent.
Yes, and also I have noted that apart from the Chief Director Dandenong, the department, and you have also sought assistance from other council like the Whitehorse, like the Knox, and the Manningham. And why and what did you find there?
Well, there were a number of deficiencies that were identified in terms of food safety understanding and food safety practices by the department's environmental health officers, but also through the third-party auditor. Angie may have more of the specific details. I think she was going to go to them in her presentation, but there were a number of deficiencies that, again, between environmental health officers from City of Greater Dandenong Council, the department and independent auditors found.
Yeah. Okay, so I just want to close this session, my part with a remark that Mr. Cook, in appearing last week, said something about the department, some of the people been using science to bamboozling the committee, which I myself, a scientist, I couldn't understand that. So that's all. Thank you.
Doctor.
Thank you, Ms. Crozier.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you all for being with us this afternoon. Dr. Sun, I just want to go straight to the death certificate of Mrs. Painter. She died of acute pulmonary edema, ischemic heart disease, and Listeria meningoencephalitis, but an autopsy wasn't undertaken. So based on that, there is no way to determine cause of death, is there?
Cause of death is not only confirmed through autopsy. There are the great majority of people who die have a diagnosis for cause of death on the basis of their clinical presentation, pathology samples that are taken, imaging samples that are taken. So I don't agree with that. The pre-existing condition of ischemic heart disease would have made her more vulnerable to pulmonary edema. Equally, having invasive listeria in the bloodstream, so a septicemia, is known to cause pulmonary edema, especially for people who've got pre-existing heart disease. And indeed, inflammation of the lining of the brain and the substance of the brain is one of the most serious illnesses that you can get. It is meningoencephalitis with bacteria that has a 1 in 4 mortality rate for those individuals who have that infection.
So when Mrs. Painter came, if I can just go into this, you've just given us a whole heap of documents just a few minutes before we came into this hearing. In that there's some pathology, and it states that on admission to hospital, Mrs. Painter had 4 days of feeling unwell. Blood tests were taken, fecal cultures, and it showed that she had a history of gastroenteritis. It was subsequently found that she had colitis and gastric ulcers. Now, Listeria can cause gastroenteritis, can it not?
Yes, it can.
Yep. And in some of these blood tests, I think Dr. Bone was referring to salmonella, but it was not detected in the fecal sample that was taken when Mrs. Painter was admitted. And there were other there's other notes in these admission notes that talk about her being unwell for quite some days before she was admitted to hospital on the 13th of January. So is it entirely possible that there could have been an underlying case of Listeria that had caused her gastroenteritis for admission?
I don't believe so. She obviously had a history of colitis.
But how do you say that when no specific tests were done at that time of admission to rule it out?
Well, just to answer, she presented with colitis and she had investigations of gastroscopy and colonoscopy that confirmed that. You can have both infectious and, not uncommonly, non-infectious causes of colitis, and with a recurrent illness, it's more likely to be non-infectious.
But her neutrophils were raised, and she had as time went on, she got sicker.
Indeed, and that can be caused by any other infectious or non-infectious cause of colitis. She didn't have a diagnosis of listeria at that time, and she developed fever and had blood cultures taken several days later. You would not have an invasive listeria infection and not become critically unwell with septicemia for several days after your admission.
But the listeria symptoms can appear anywhere between 3 and 70 days post-exposure and can include symptoms such as what Mrs. Painter experienced. Is that correct?
Yes and no. The incubation period for illness is often described as between 3 and 70 days. In fact, it's between 3 and 67 days in the literature. Up to 67 days is exclusively for pregnant women. For other invasive listeriosis cases, it is essentially up to 14 days only. So for septicemia and meningoencephalitis, it does not have an incubation period up to 67 days. It's really only up to 14 days. She spent 10 of those 14 days in hospital prior to developing her illness. So the great majority of the likely incubation period where she might have been exposed to listeria was during her Knox Private Hospital admission.
But I think there's no definitive here, is there, Dr. Sutton? Because of her medical certificate, the death certificate, you cannot exclusively say that she died of listeriosis based on that death certificate. That's correct, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. You cannot say on any one single piece of information that it is absolutely definitive. What I'm saying is that if you have invasive listeriosis, you've got a 1 in 4 chance of dying, whether or not it was the sole cause of her death or the most significant contributor to her death. She got invasive listeria disease from eating contaminated food that was linked to iCook Kitchen, both epidemiologically and genomically.
But you've already admitted in this hearing that you got it wrong in the evidence that you provided to the committee last year.
Ms. Crozier, you've run out of time.
What a shame.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Limbrick.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for appearing today. Professor Sutton, you mentioned something at the start of today about how you weren't aware of the multiple suppliers being that were going to the hospital. And in the very short time I've had to look at these email trails, they seem to definitively say that iCook Foods are the only supplier to the hospital. Does this sort of indicate that at the time the department was not aware that there was other food suppliers, that they were acting as if iCook Foods was the only supplier? Because these emails don't seem to indicate any sort of awareness that I can see that there were other suppliers and therefore they wouldn't have been investigated if they weren't aware of them.
I'll pass to Angie because she was involved in the incident management team on the following day that had that additional information from Mr. Christie, if I may.
Yeah, certainly happy to answer that. I think it's important to know that we only investigate suppliers of high-risk foods for listeria, just to try and to focus our investigations. And so the information that we were being provided by Knox Private Hospitals through their infection control team, which is our normal procedure, was that any high-risk foods for listeria were provided by iCook. So that's why our attention went to iCook. It doesn't mean that that was our exclusive focus. As you've heard, we were investigating other areas, but eventually we followed the evidence, and eventually the focus became clearer and clearer that iCook had to be the focus of our investigation because of everything that we were finding. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. But we also heard evidence that there was some other high-risk foods being like apparently some of the soft sandwiches that were being produced were not from iCook Foods. They were produced within the hospital itself. So were those sources investigated as well?
Yeah, it's correct that there were some other high-risk suppliers, but we only heard about those on the 22nd of February after the closure order. And by then we had such, a clear focus on concerns about an ongoing risk for public health that we focused on that as opposed to looking at those other suppliers. I think it's worth also noting that there were no further cases of listeria after that point, and have been no further cases ever since with that particular genetic type. That I think our focus was in the right place in iCook.
But those samples of the other suppliers, like meat products, for example, were they not tested?
They are tested routinely under the regulatory regime that's managed by PrimeSafe, but not specifically for this particular investigation.
Okay, understand. Thank you.
And just to add, Mr. Limbrick, I think Dr. Bone's saying if there were an unmitigated ongoing source of contaminated food that had not been identified, because if it had been through routine testing or through other illness, it would have been known to us. If that had continued without being mitigated, we would have seen ongoing cases in the community for another source that was never identified.
But didn't you just say earlier that that there were thousands of these meals sent out from iCook Foods that we didn't see any results from that weren't identified? We only saw one that was identified. Surely that could have been the case from another supplier, couldn't it?
Yes, but if they had contamination in their kitchen, and Listeria, as you've heard previously through the inquiry, finds an environmental niche and then continues to cross-contaminate or contaminate food in those premises, unless it's identified and addressed. So if there were another supplier, whether primary production or a kitchen, that was never addressed, then the likelihood of there being no further illness with it not being addressed is quite small.
But you didn't check?
We have had no subsequent identification of genetically related Listeria monocytogenes anywhere in Australia with this genetic fingerprint.
Thank you. Ms. Vagella.
Thanks, Chair. And thanks to the team for appearing today in front of the committee for this hearing. My question is for Dr. Bone. The committee heard in the inquiry last year that the department first became involved in investigations on the 25th of January after being notified by Knox Private Hospital that the patient's blood culture test had grown Listeria. How did your team determine the source of the patient's listeriosis? You touched base on this one, but I would like to hear a little bit more about this.
Yeah, so we have a very clear listeriosis protocol. So one of the first things we do is try to speak to the patient to find out what their food history is. If we can't find out that food history directly from the patient, then we go to other sources. And particularly if a case is related to a hospital, we are speaking to the infection control team, because they are the people who are responsible for infection control in the hospital, but also have access to the medical records, unlike, say, a catering team would have access. And then we obtain a 4-week food history because of this longer incubation period. I noticed that Mr. Christie was referring to a 4-day food history, and that's really not correct for a listeriosis case. So we look at all possible sources. We cast the net as wide as we possibly can, and then we will approach council to go and take samples and just check the food safety processes of the various suppliers, and that's what we did in this case. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, so then what evidence made you decide that there was a need to ask the City of Greater Dandenong to further investigate iCook Foods as the potential source of contamination?
So as you'll see from the emails that we were getting from the infection control nurse, we were being clearly told that iCook Foods was the supplier of any high-risk foods for Listeria was iCook Foods. So that's why we went straight to iCook Foods. And the City of Greater Dandenong is the regulating authority for iCook Foods. So it was appropriate for them to go and do the sampling. And
this question either you can answer or Professor Sutton can answer. Why are food premises like iCook Foods required to have a food safety plan that outlines how they control and manage food safety hazards, including listeria?
Shall I take that, Brett? Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely part of the Food Standards Code and all of the Food Act legislation, that it's really very important that particularly when you're handling food for high risk, vulnerable consumers, that you identify all hazards and you put in all critical controls that you need to mitigate that hazard. And this was one of our contentions, that iCook Foods had not done an adequate assessment of both the hazards, but also put in adequate controls to ensure that the food that they were supplying was safe and suitable, as required by the Food Act.
So the department had concerns about the food safety program in place at iCook Foods.
Yes, that and many other aspects of their operations.
And so going back again to the patient. Now, given the patient had been in a hospital for over a week, how do you determine that the woman wasn't ill from food she ate before she was admitted to hospital? Because we are hearing this conflicting information. So how did you determine?
Well, we got information from the treating doctor, and we had access to the discharge summary notes, which provides a lot of information about the tests and the condition that the lady was suffering from. And there was no suggestion of listeriosis on admission at all. I note that she did have slightly raised white blood cell count, which you would see in an infection, but more often you just see that in the kind of inflammation, the gastritis and colitis that was having. If she'd had an invasive listeriosis on admission, she would have been much more unwell, and there would be many more signs. And I think that the doctors and the nurses at Knox Hospital would have been able to make that diagnosis. So as far as I'm concerned, there was no suggestion of listeriosis. And as Britt has said, given the incubation period—
It's pure speculation, Dr.
Miss Crozier.
Yeah, if I could finish, the incubation period fits. And also, if you'll look at the death certificate, the onset is suggested to be around the 21st of January as well, which suggests, 2 weeks before her death. So that it all just ties up. We can never be absolutely definitive in this situation, but we don't have to be absolutely definitive in order to take action to protect public health. And I think that's also an important point. We've heard about this idea that it needs to be beyond reasonable doubt, or we need to be 100% certain, and that's not the requirement. And if it was, we would have many more public health challenges than we do already.
Yep. And would Professor Sutton would like to add anything to the answer that Dr. Bone has given?
In 30 seconds.
Yeah, only that the food history obviously included the foods that she might normally have eaten at home, and the sampling at Coles and Woolworths reflected that. So some of the high-risk foods that she might have purchased from those establishments as well.
Thank you. Ms. Crozier.
Thank you. If I can just go back to Dr. Sutton, if I may. Dr. Sutton, you spoke about the authority that you had under the various acts. What instrument, have you got a signed instrument of delegation?
Yes, I do.
Okay, could you provide that to the committee for us?
Of course.
Thank you. In relation to those that signage, I want to just go back to this issue about the other 6 suppliers. Bid Foods, who is a supplier to Knox, actually has meat and other products that could be contaminant with listeria. And the department never went there to investigate those 6 suppliers. Isn't that negligent? In this very serious issue, you've gone out there and you've shut a business. And Dr. Sutton, you said you didn't get any emails. Well, from Dr. Bone, on the very day that you issued the closure order, Dr. Bone says to you in an email, no records of what foods eaten by patients, choose from a wide menu. Now, there's a whole lot of conflicting issues going on here, and this is what this committee is trying to establish, because only just a few weeks ago, a man died. A company was investigated by the department. It wasn't shut down. You didn't go out and make a public statement about the dangers of that company and the listeriosis that caused that man's. Why is there such a difference here? And I think this is what the public want to understand, and this is why we are having this. So I think there are a lot of issues here, and your evidence of last year doesn't stack up with what we heard with Mr. Christie last week and the emails that were provided to the department. So can you explain why those 6 companies that those other providers to Knox were not investigated?
As Dr. Bone stated, well, firstly, I didn't have that information at the time of the closure order. So there was no possibility for me to consider that with respect to the closure, but I made the closure anyway on the basis of all of that information that I've provided. With respect to the other suppliers, as Dr. Bone has said, many of them provide very low risk foods, tea, coffee and the like, some of which is not so-called ready to eat food. It goes through a cook-kill process, which would remove the risk of listeria if done properly. And the foods that were noted in the food history were examined both in the cases normal purchasing as well as at iCook Foods. And when we had definitive, really, genomically linked evidence of...
You said close to genetically. It wasn't definitive. I'm sorry to cut across you, but that's the point here. Close is not good enough. This business was shut down. Businesses were lost. And no other patient got sick.
It is expected that there would be minor genetic differences in the evolution of bacteria as they move from foods to patients or from food sampled at one point in time to a later point in time. As I've said, there have been no other foods, environmental swabs or food samples or patient samples at any other point before or after.
But you didn't investigate them. Did you investigate other patients?
All invasive listeria cases are notified in every jurisdiction in Australia.
We were told last week, I'm sorry again, time is of the essence. We were told that those sandwiches came in a big tray. If they were contaminated, you would think that there would be multiple sandwiches contaminated and multiple people getting sick. Would you not?
So there may well have been multiple sandwiches contaminated. Not everyone becomes sick when they ingest contaminated food. Some of them will have mild illness, never seek medical care. Some will seek medical care, never have a specimen taken.
They were in a hospital. They weren't outside.
Indeed. The point remains, not everyone becomes unwell if they consume contaminated food.
But the meat didn't come from, it came from Bid Foods. I mean, that was linked in other states, was it not? I mean, that meat came from other states that you didn't look into properly.
Angie, do you want to address that?
Certainly, all I would say is that we follow the evidence and we focus our investigations on where that strongest evidence is. And I can only reiterate the evidence that we had that revealed that there was severe problems and a ongoing risk of public health, which meant a public health risk that meant that we needed to act there. And we have had no further cases.
Well, why didn't you shut the last company down and can't go out there and publicly name them?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. As I say, we follow the evidence and we take a risk-based proportionate approach. So the other company that was involved in the listeriosis case, you're quite right, there has been a case and we did investigate them. Firstly, that the case had a very different listeria genetic sequence to the isolates that were found in this company. But secondly,
sorry,
may I finish?
Ms. Crozier, let her answer the question.
Thank you. Secondly, whilst there were some minor shortcomings in their processes, it was nothing to the scale of the failures.
A man died.
I'd still like to finish responding, if I may. Yes, a man died, but as I say, if you just let me finish, I can explain to you what the issue is. So there was a different genetic sequence of the listeria in the case to those isolates from the company. So that means that there was another source. The second thing is that whilst there were some minor shortcomings in this company, just like there always are, they were nothing to the scale of the shortcomings from iCook Foods.
But the genomes, Ms. Crozier, you're out of time. The genomes were found in WA and Queensland.
Ms. Crozier, you are out of time. Thank you, Ms. Watt.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for appearing before us today. I just had a question about outside suppliers to iCook Foods. And how did you determine that the listeria wasn't due to contaminated items from outside suppliers such as ham and cheese brought in to make the sandwiches?
Yeah, thank you. Shall I take that?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So we did follow back through the suppliers, particularly of the meat, the small goods, so the ham and the silver side. What we found was that the regulator for those businesses is PrimeSafe. So we referred it to them to follow up, and they looked through the records that they had in the previous sampling and were not able to find any records of listeria detections that were relevant to the investigation. And for one of the suppliers, they were actually able to do a sample of the exact batch. So that is the main explanation. The other thing I would just say is that we had evidence of cross-contamination between foods in iCook Foods, because 4 foods had exactly the same genetic sequence, which suggests that it perhaps was brought in by one supplier, but then iCook Foods, because of their poor handling, spread that listeria strain from one food to another, to another, to another, so that we had 4 all with the same listeria sequence.
So cross-contamination clearly was a very big issue. Now, you spoke just in the last answer about the scale of difference. Can you talk to me about the scale of the problem that was there at iCook Foods that led to cross-contamination and other issues?
Yeah, so from what I was informed by the team who visited, from the information that we had from City of Greater Dandenong, there were real issues with the way the processes were set up, so that the workflow processes, the way foods, raw foods and cooked foods and ready to eat foods were kind of crossing each other. The way people were crossing each other in the business meant that it was very easy for cross-contamination. There were also issues, as we know, around the floor, and wherever it's damp, this is where listeria can grow and get worse. And we also, have evidence that the food safety programme just wasn't adequate for the scale and scope of the business that iCook was undertaking. And lastly, there were issues to do with the training of supervisors, which meant, again, that we couldn't be sure that iCook operations were providing safe and suitable food as required by the Food Act.
Thank you, Dr. Bone. I just, according to the Public Health and Wellbeing Act, if the public health risk poses a serious threat, lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as a reason for postponing measures to prevent or control a public health risk. Can you talk to us a little bit more in detail about what that means for you in your role as the Deputy Chief Officer, or indeed the Chief Officer, whoever is most appropriate to answer that question?
Yeah, I can start, and I'm sure Brett can add further.
Yes,
that yes, absolutely. That the standard of beyond reasonable doubt and being 100% certain applies to things like when you would do a prosecution. When your focus is on protecting public health, we always have to act with the best information that we possibly have, and we're balancing the information that is coming in with the risk that is being posed, and eventually we get to a point where we feel that we have sufficient evidence, which means that it is appropriate to act in order to protect public health. And I honestly think in this situation that if we hadn't acted, there may well have been further cases, and if we hadn't acted, we'd be before a committee explaining why we hadn't acted given all of the evidence that we had. But I'll hand over to Brett. He may wish to add further.
Thanks, Angie. Obviously, the lack of scientific certainty is one of those considerations against the potential severity of the public health risk. That includes the potential number of people who might be affected, and indeed their risk of developing serious illness. And so those two factors were both at play here. There were 7,000 meals produced, and as I said earlier, the overwhelming majority of those populations, patients in hospital, Meals on Wheels recipients, and those in aged care settings, are particularly vulnerable to severe illness and a higher risk of dying, a higher risk of invasive listeriosis. And so it's the combination of those things that means that you should take action, because if you wait, for example, a cluster of cases, then there might be several thousand individuals who've already been exposed to listeria, and their incubation period is yet to play out, and you can't intervene to, for example, prevent them from becoming unwell if they've already consumed that food and if the incubation period is already playing through.
Thank you. No further questions, Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Ondaatje.
Professor Sutton, 7,000 pre-prepared meals a week by iCook Foods and no other cases of listeria, other than according to you that there may or may not have been. A number of other suppliers to Knox Hospital, Bidfood, SHA, Ready Milk, Juice & Co, GWS, Tip Top, Mr. Donut, and of course iCook Foods, and only iCook Foods were checked out. When Dr. Bone says there were severe problems, there's an ongoing risk to public health, are you satisfied? Are you satisfied that when you signed that order, albeit you said you didn't have all the information in this hearing, are you satisfied that you got all the things you needed to sign that off, despite the fact none of these other people being checked out, and 7,000 pre-prepared meals a week and no other cases of listeria other than your speculation?
Yes, I am.
That might come back at you. The CEO of the City of Greater Dandenong yesterday, in his evidence, said that the advice to close iCook Foods bore no relation to what was happening at Knox Hospital. He said that in evidence yesterday. Yet you went out in your statement and absolutely tied the two together, including the evidence you've given today. So was the CEO of the City of Greater Dandenong wrong, was he?
I haven't heard his testimony, but as I have stated here today and previously, the food supplied to Knox Hospital, in particular the high-risk foods and the foods identified by food history, including next of kin, including information provided by food monitors at Knox Private Hospital, indicated that the case consumed those foods and that those foods were sandwiches and that those sandwiches were supplied by iCook Foods.
Is it usual practice that patients source food from other sources?
I don't know what you mean by that. Sorry, Mr. Ondaatje.
Well, when I've visited loved ones in hospital, I see patients in the hospital consuming food that is other than that from the hospital.
Oh, indeed, that can happen for some individuals, no question.
Does that happen? Did that form part of your investigation to check that that was the only source?
Yes, in taking a food history, you would try and determine all potential sources of food in that 4-week period, absolutely.
So if that was the case, why wasn't the other suppliers, as I've mentioned today, given what Dr. Bone said about the challenge to ongoing risk to public health, about being sure that that this was the case at iCook Foods, why weren't they investigated as a thorough part of this process?
Well, I think we've spoken to that. At the time that we investigated, the highest risk foods were from iCook Foods kitchen. We then subsequently identified contamination of their foods across a number of foods that indicated the potential for cross-contamination and Listeria monocytogenes establishing a niche in that kitchen, and the genetic fingerprint, which would indicate that any other source was vanishingly unlikely.
I think, and I think I'll speak on behalf of many of my constituents, they're looking for some certainty from you in terms of what actually happened, as opposed to what didn't happen. They look for that every day through your press conferences. I'm not sure that we've had some certainty about you that the process was completely thorough.
Is there a question there?
Do you agree or disagree?
I disagree.
So you think not investigating those other companies, not checking out where other food sources come from, 7,000 pre-prepared meals a week out of iCook Foods and no other cases of listeria other than your speculation, you're convinced that you got it right on this occasion?
I am. I accept that there is no single piece of evidence that is definitive on the body of multiple issues of evidence with regard to the food safety program, the food safety supervisor's knowledge, the sampling that was done that identified a unique genetic fingerprint across foods that was highly related to that of the case eating foods that were epidemiologically linked to iCook Foods. These are things that satisfy me that the closure order, despite having really awful and significant consequences for the business and all of the individuals that it is employed, was the right thing to do to protect potentially thousands upon thousands of people from being exposed to a deadly illness.
I don't think the job was done thoroughly. No further questions.
Thank you. Ms. Fegela.
Thanks, Chair. Professor Sutton, can you please explain why a varied order was issued to iCook Foods on 23rd February, 2 days after the initial closure order was signed?
Essentially, it's because we had the information about what the deficiencies were with respect to the food safety program and the structural issues at play that would contribute to the risk of Listeria being maintained in that environment. And it was to allow the lower risk foods to continue production on the basis that those issues were addressed, so as to give iCook Foods a pathway to reopening, to producing foods again in a way that could be done safely and to keep the business operating.
So how did the management at iCook Foods respond to this varied order? Surely they would have been pleased that they would be able to restart production of some food items and minimize the impact of the closure on their business.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. You would have to go to them directly, but it was intended as a pathway for them to produce food safely again. And clearly there were some costs involved, as there always are, when we've shut factories with Listeria contamination in the past, and Jindy cheese is an example. It was an extremely expensive process for them to bring the structural issues up to a standard to make sure that that risk was addressed in full. And so there would have been costs involved, but we were working to ensure that they understood the standards that needed to be met and the specific remediations that needed to take place, both in terms of the food safety program, the cleaning and the remediation structurally.
So did you observe any remedial actions taken by iCook Foods to follow the advice provided about what they needed to do before the closure order could be lifted?
Yes, there were some. Mr. Goldsmith might have more details, but there were some actions taken, no question, in terms of work being done on the floor. The clean was done, and there was work on protocols and flows. For whatever reason, that process stalled, and the conditions for reopening, really informed by the independent audit, were not met. So reopening did not occur.
So is that the usual response from food manufacturers when they are told that there is a potential link between their food product and serious incidents of foodborne illness?
No, it's not. I do accept that the impost for getting all of the issues right for Listeria contamination are really substantial. For Campylobacter or Salmonella, it is less often a structural issue of a kitchen and more of the introduction of bacteria and food processes and food safety standards, and those can be addressed somewhat more readily than those really substantial engineering changes that are often required for Listeria contamination. But most businesses would say, what do I need to do? How can I do it most quickly, and seek the guidance and cooperation of the department to make that happen.
So what support did your team give to iCook Foods to help them resolve the issues and restart production as soon as possible?
Yeah, Paul or Angie, I know they worked with them every single day, and there were tensions around some of the things that we understood to be required, but I know that they made themselves available and provided guidance on a daily basis.
Yeah, I just confirm that we had two members of staff who were visiting the premises to try to assess what the problems were and then provide advice. And we also had multiple telephone calls over the weeks that it finally took to try to get iCook up and running again. And that was always our intention, to be as positive and as supportive and to get them to the standard that they needed to be able to provide safe and suitable food to vulnerable people.
So, Professor Sutton, there is some confusion. We have heard before that the closure order was done on a wrong act. Can you please shed some light on that, about what act it should have been, or was it done under correct act?
Yes, it was done under the correct act. I guess the unconventional element was that it was under Chief Health Officer powers in the Food Act rather than CEO of Greater Dandenong Council. I approached the CEO of City of Greater Dandenong Council to put in effect that closure himself. He spoke of his conflict of interest and therefore it was my powers under the Food Act that needed to be exercised in order for that recommendation to be put into effect.
Thank you, Ms. Figella.
Thanks, Chair.
I've just, as I mentioned previously, it was Mr. Christie's emails that instigated the reopening of this inquiry. And I'm interested to hear what triggered the request to Mr. Christie to undertake further investigation at the hospital.
Angie.
Yeah, I can take that. So as I was saying, listeriosis investigations are led by the department. We were focusing down on iCook Foods because we were following the evidence, but we wanted to contact Knox City Hospital to just also understand how they were handling iCook Foods once it had arrived, because we wanted to ensure that they weren't mishandling, for example, the food once it had arrived, and we wanted to understand more about how the food, which patients received what foods. So that was really why we made contact with Knox City Council. And we wanted to look at food safety programme and food safety audits as well for completeness there. That was the reason, but it wasn't something that we needed to do right at the very beginning. I know there was talk about this delay, and I think that's because there was confusion about whether this was a single case of gastroenteritis procedure or a listeriosis procedure.
Yes. Look, it's probably my ignorance on this, but why weren't swabs and that type of investigation, swabs taken of the Knox Hospital kitchen at the time? I would have thought that would have been the first place to go.
Really because of the information, again, that we were getting from the infection control nurse, that all of the high-risk food was coming from iCook Foods. So that was the first place that we looked. We did eventually get some swabs from Knox City Hospital, but that was, I think, around the 26th of February. I don't know if Sally, I know that you were very involved in those decisions at the moment, whether you wanted to add anything to that?
Just that we had been indicated that the foods that we brought in from iCook came in sealed. And so the risk of contamination at Knox Private was pretty minimal because they already came in pre-sealed and ready to serve, things like that. So in a normal investigation where food is already sealed and just served straight to the patient in this instance, we then go straight to the manufacturer of the food because there's been no ability to cross-contaminate or anything that food at that time.
Can I just seek some clarification on that? I think we'd heard that the sandwiches came on big trays, but I know certainly the patient's family said that she had a packaged sandwich, and so is that how they arrived, as a single use or single serve packaged food?
That's what I understood them to come in as, yes, which is why I went directly to. I did not at the time when I spoke to the infection control nurse. That's the sort of information we get right at the beginning. It was indicated in the email on the 29th of January that things came in ready to go from iCook. So, and the information I had was that they came in as a single serve, sealed, ready to go.
Thank you, Ms. Watt.
Thank you, Chair. I might just be a little different and have a question for Mr. Stenton. That goes to Community Chef in particular. You've told the committee that the Department of Health's organisation and government structures are specifically designed such that you avoid potential conflicts between the Chief Health Officer and his regulatory roles on public health matters and the department's financial and funding decision roles. Given the separation of these roles that has been the subject of recent scrutiny, particularly by some witnesses, can you please provide details of how indeed they are kept separate there at the Department of Health?
Thank you, Ms. Watt. So first, as the evidence I gave in the last inquiry, the organisation structure itself separates the regulatory functions of the department and the management of those from policy and funding decisions. So we have different divisions. There's a public health division which holds the regulatory functions. Policy decisions, particularly those around funding for Community Chef at the time, were in a separate division, an aged care branch in a separate division. The decision making of those divisions, so in a policy sense, if we were taking a decision to provide funding to Community Chef or to acquire Community Chef, that would flow up through the management line to Secretary or Minister. The regulatory functions, as Brett has outlined, there are specific statutory powers that the Chief Health Officer has, and I won't purport to know them as well as Brett, but they are statutory in nature and authorise Brett to take certain decisions and or advise ministers and secretaries of risk mitigation strategies, and they flow directly from the Public Health Division. So the two conversations never meet in terms of decision making. They are separate and kept separate for that very reason, that the department is a funder of many services, some of which have regulatory intersections with public health.
So further to that, so what involvement does then the Office of the Chief Health Officer have in the relationship with Community Chef?
None. Other than in the same way that Community Chef as a commercial provider would be subject to food regulation rules, and in the same way that iCook have inspections from local government, and where there's an issue such as this one would be subject to Chief Health Officer directions, Community Chef would be the same. As previously advised to the committee, the relationship between Community Chef and the department was around food security and food continuity for home and community care and disability. When I last appeared at the committee, we were in the process of finalising acquisition of Community Chef for food continuity at Western Health. That acquisition has now been finalised, but that they were policy related relationship on food for vulnerable people in the community, and subsequently, as previously advised, we had provided recallable grants. We had some food and kitchen continuity issues at Western Health. We looked at various options at that, and they were policy decisions. No conversation, at no point was iCook ever considered as part of that, and not discussed, mainly because the people making those decisions would be completely unaware of the iCook issue as a public health issue. So that transaction has now been finalised. And by way of comparison, I know from a public interest point of view, that transaction involved us forgiving those recallable grants and funding Western Health to pay out the liabilities of Community Chef in the order of about $7 million to build or replace the kitchen facility that we required at Western Health was in the order of $25 to $30 million. So from a community value for money proposition, it was the right policy direction, and as I say, had no consideration whatsoever of anything happening at iCook.
So the Chief Health Officer and the Office of the Chief Health Officer were never consulted with regarding the purchase decision for Community Chef?
None whatsoever.
Okay, I'm happy to leave it at that if there's anything else.
Thank you, Ms. Watt. Dr. Bark.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Bone, why didn't you correct Dr. Sutton when he was misleading this inquiry and this committee on the 24th of June last year?
Regarding the sole caterer, I believe you're referring to. Yeah, yes. That's because I had also understood at that point that it was a sole case, that iCook was the sole caterer. So
that's not true. You said, Dr. Bone, you said to this committee just earlier in this particular hearing that on the 22nd of February, you met with your team to discuss the email from Mr. Christie that Dr. Sutton himself said was the reason, when he ultimately, apparently very late in the day, became aware of it, for his change of heart. So you did know, Dr. Bone.
If you'd let me finish, I can explain to you what happened. So
please.
Thank you. So it was raised, as I say, at this meeting at the IMT on the 22nd of February. What was raised was that there was a possibility that the patient was on a soft diet and that some of the components...
It was confirmed. There wasn't a possibility.
Dr. Barr, please let her answer the question.
The language in the report was that it was confirmed. Dr. Sutton also verbaled Mr. Christie earlier on in his testimony. He said it was suggested she was on a soft diet. The language of the official report that you received and you discussed on the 22nd of February 2019 was that it was confirmed. So please don't misrepresent the evidence that you're referring to.
Again, if I could finish, then you would understand what I'm trying to say to you. So it was raised at the IMT, but I didn't receive an email that says it was confirmed. That was sent to the staff, not myself. So I didn't see that email. What was raised at the incident management team was that there was a suggestion. The incident management team was at 1 p.m. That the confirmatory email arrived at 12:41. I'm not even sure it had been read at that point. But regardless, what was raised was that there was a suggestion of a soft diet and that some of the soft diet items were made in the hospital. When we followed that up, we were told again that it was a full diet, and I had understood from the team, and that may be my misunderstanding, that it had also been discounted, that not only was she not on a soft diet, but that the food wasn't supplied by the hospital. So when we came to prepare statements last time, my understanding had been that it had been concluded that they were the sole caterer. So having gone back through, when all of these emails were raised, having gone back through all of the records and my own notes, I was reminded of this situation, and that's all that situation was. It was no deliberate attempt to mislead. It was a misunderstanding. And as Brett has said, and as I would have said if I'd been able to continue my statement, that component of the information didn't mean that any of the decisions hinged on that particular component of the information. I hope that's clear for you.
Let's get to that then. Because again, time and time again in our hearing on the 24th of June last year, we were told that iCook Food was the sole caterer. Professor Sutton said that on multiple occasions, and you were sat next to him, Dr. Bone, and he was not contradicted. As a former official within the Department of Human Services, I've got to say that the idea that this critical information wasn't escalated either to you, Dr. Bone, or to Professor Sutton simply doesn't scan. But nonetheless, both of you say that you knew nothing about it. Can I ask you about the radical shift in what you've presented today regarding the need to investigate other food sources? On multiple occasions today, we've heard that there's only a need to investigate high-risk food sources. That's been the language that you've used. That is utterly different from what you told us, Dr. Sutton and Dr. Bone, last year. I've got the transcript here. Dr. Sutton, you told us, this is a direct quote from you, sir, all the other potential sources of food for the deceased patient were investigated for the presence of any listeria whatsoever. That is the polar opposite of what you, Dr. Bone, and you, Dr. Sutton, have told us today, that you would only focus on high-risk foods. Dr. Bone, you said the same thing. We were following up a large number of different potential leads, so not only investigating iCook foods, but also all of the food that the patient had eaten. What has led to this radical change, utter change, complete change of position from the department? Because I've got to tell you, it's very convenient for you.
I would disagree that this is a radical change. I think really what we're trying to do it has always been the case that it is high-risk food only, because that is exactly what is in our protocols, and that is how these investigations happen across the world.
The opposite of what you said last time.
Dr. Barr, please let the witness respond.
Yeah, the reason that we've emphasised it this time is because it became clear that perhaps the committee didn't understand fully that we focus only on high risk. So that's why we've emphasised it.
Because you told us the opposite.
Dr.
Don't
Barr,
blame us.
It's
outrageous.
in the testimony, you're going to run out of
Dr.
time now. I'm sorry, you're out of time, Dr. Bart.
The evidence provided to
had
this
you
in the report
had you
is
actually let the witness answer the question, you may have got your answer.
Hang on a minute.
Instead of
Chair.
interrupting.
More lies would have been
Dr. Q.
unuseful for our
Thank
inquiry.
you, Dr. Q.
Thank you. I have a question for Professor Sutton, but before I go there, I just had a quick look at the statement provided by Mr. Christie to the police, and it was exact quote that is unlikely that the patient was on anything but soft diet. So whether it's confirmation or not, because it's not a very definite question, definite statement. And now let me go back to Professor Sutton. Last year, when we had our inquiry, and we the committee has concluded that the closure of the iCook Food acted by you, then an acting chief health officer, was prepared and served on valid grounds and for a proper purpose. So in your view, what constitutes valid grounds and proper purpose, Professor Sutton?
It's that I make my judgments on the basis of protecting public health and according to the principles indeed of the Food Act and similarly of the Public Health and Wellbeing Act. They have been raised in part today that relates to lack of absolute certainty and the precautionary principle, but also that of proportionality and to make a reasonable and rational decision that is based on evidence. And so those are the elements that came together in that decision making.
Yeah, the reason I like confirmation from you, because there are people who offer different views of that conclusion. Now going to the proper position as you are, or as you were acting chief health officer, could you explain to the committee for our benefits the differences in the statutory responsibility between the Public Health and Wellbeing Act and the Food Safety Act in relation to the closure of iCook Foods?
In terms of the statutory powers, they can be affected in the same way. The Food Act relates to the entire regulatory scheme in relation to food safety and all of the elements of food production and food service. The Public Health and Wellbeing Act is broad and covers all of those protections that you want to ensure with respect to all public health threats. They cut across communicable disease, environmental health threats, and those in food safety. And they're, as you'd be aware with COVID, broad and flexible in terms of being able to be applied to any particular risks. The Food Act has other statutory position holders who have powers enabled under that Act, including the authorised officers under that Act. And as I've said, the CEOs of local council, but the Chief Health Officer is clearly referenced in that Act as well for some of those important actions such as the closure of the business or, for example, preventing access to a site or gaining evidence from a site.
Thank you. And my next question is to Dr. Bourne. You mentioned earlier that there were some staff from the department come to iCook Foods facility to inspect whether the afterwards, after the closure order was served. Before then, were there any staff visited the place in relation to the concerns raised by the City Council environmental health officers?
No, I understand.
To verify the situation there?
Certainly. I understand that the first time that any of our staff visited iCook Foods was on the 22nd of February. So that the information preceding the closure order about food safety programme, food safety processes, etc., and the conditions of the premises were coming to us via City of Greater Dandenong environmental health officers.
Okay. No, that's all the question I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Limbrick.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Sutton, the decision to close down iCook Foods and name them publicly in interviews and press and in the press, what informs that decision on whether to name a company or not? Because one of the concerns that's been raised is that the idea that they would be able to reopen after that sort of publicity is nearly impossible. What informs that decision?
Clearly, the naming of a company makes it the objective focus for media and for the general community. We're acutely aware of that. One of the issues that I consider certainly is the likelihood that that information will become public and whether we will be seen as trying to hide information that the public is entitled to know and would seek and be entitled to know. And we clearly prompted Knox to send out to all of the recipients of food, for example, the Meals on Wheels recipients, to make sure that they didn't consume that food. It would have been immediately understood where that food was coming from and would have been immediately known to media. And so it was for the sake of transparency that decision was made.
Last week.
But I mean, if we're acting, in an abundance of caution, it seems clear from Mr. Christie's testimony that for at least part of the patient's stay in the hospital, that she was on a soft food diet and preferred sandwiches, and then likely had eaten something that was prepared at the hospital. It seems strange to me still. I still don't really understand why swabs weren't taken earlier at the hospital on the sandwiches being prepared at the hospital as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure what to add beyond what Dr. Bone has said in relation to that, and Ms. Atkinson. I mean, the abundance of caution is about closing a food premises when there's a significant risk to very large numbers of vulnerable individuals. The soft diet, as you've heard from Mrs. Painter's next of kin, related to a subsequent readmission out of rehab, which was after her illness, and was likely related to her confusion because of the beginning of her meningoencephalitis and a risk of aspiration should she be on a normal diet.
Mm-hmm. And okay, yeah, understood. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you for appearing today and for taking the time. It's been very valuable. As I mentioned at the outset, you'll receive a transcript of today's hearing. Please do have a look at it. Make sure that we haven't misheard or misrepresented you in any way. The committee will just take a short break to bring on the next witness. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, committee.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back. This is the Legal and Social Issues Committee's public hearing into the inquiry into the closure of iCook Foods. We are joined for this part of the hearing by former Health Minister, Ms. Jenny Mikakos. Ms. Mikakos, just for the sake of time, I won't reintroduce the committee. I think most of the people who are members of the public who are watching have also had a time to get to know these committee members. So just by way of explanation, all evidence taken is protected by parliamentary privilege. As you know, this is under our Constitution Act, but also the standing orders of the Legislative Council. Therefore, any information that you provide during this hearing is protected by law. You're protected against any actions for what you might say at this hearing, but if you were to go elsewhere and repeat the same things, those comments may not have the same privilege. Any deliberately false evidence or misleading of the committee may be considered a contempt of Parliament. As you'd be aware, this hearing is being recorded and you will receive a transcript of the hearing. I encourage you to have a look at that to make sure that we have not misheard you or misrepresented you. If you'd like to make some opening remarks, we'll then open it up to committee discussion. Thank you. And thank you for appearing today.
Thank you, Ms. Patton. Now, can I just check firstly that you can see me? Because I understand from your...
No, we can't see you, Ms. Mikakos.
I can't... it says the video is on, so I'm not quite sure what the issue is.
To us, it says your camera is off. But, no. No.
Okay, look,
for the sake... We can hear you loud and clear. That's the most important thing.
Right. Okay. Well, all right. Look, perhaps I might proceed and perhaps there might be some technical solution. Can I firstly begin with an opening statement? And I want to do so because I want to incorporate my written submission to the committee for the public record, but I also wanted to add some additional comments.
Yeah, I appreciate this will be 5 minutes.
Yes, I hope so. As the committee is aware, this committee decided last year not to call me before the inquiry when I was the Minister for Health, as all relevant information was able to be obtained directly from departmental officials. This remains the case now. I've been invited to comment about matters almost a year after my resignation as the Minister in circumstances where I no longer have access to departmental officials to brief me in this matter. I have no hesitation in urging the committee to seek from Minister Foley any departmental documentation that may be relevant to this matter. In my 21 years as a Member of Parliament, I'm unable to recall a situation in which a former minister was asked to appear before a parliamentary inquiry relating to their previous portfolio. The convention is that the Minister of the day is required to respond to any request for information for their predecessors. Having said that, I indicated my willingness to assist the committee in this matter as best as I'm able, bearing in mind all the limitations I have indicated. I requested questions, and when they were not forthcoming, I provided a written submission. As is apparent from his own evidence last year and reaffirmed in his evidence today, the decision to close iCook Foods was made by the then Acting Chief Health Officer, Professor Brett Sutton, under the Food Act. In making my previous public comments in this matter, including in the Parliament, I relied on advice provided to me by Dr. Sutton and other departmental officials. If there are any questions about what evidence Dr. Sutton or other departmental officials relied on or what process they undertook in issuing their closure order, then those questions should be put directly to those officials, and I'm unable to comment on such operational issues. I undertook my role as a minister to serve the people of Victoria and their interests very seriously and with integrity. The first finding of the committee's report last year was that the Chief Health Officer's decision was made validly and for a proper purpose. In respect of the iCook closure, I do not believe that my former departmental officials acted with any improper purpose or motive in issuing the closure notice. I'm expressing a personal belief or opinion here because I'm not aware of anything that would suggest otherwise. I want to make some final points. First, I want to express my condolences to the family and friends of Mrs. Jean Painter, and in particular to her daughters who gave evidence today. I'm pleased you were given a voice. I also want to express my sympathy to the Cook family and to the former staff of iCook Foods. I'm sorry if anything I said in Parliament offended you. As I explained earlier, in making my previous public comments in this matter, including in the Parliament, I relied on advice provided to me by Dr. Sutton and other departmental officials. To my great surprise, I received some text messages from Ian Cook soon after I resigned last year, and there were repeated attempts to contact me. They were supportive messages, and I want to thank Ian Cook for what he said. But I want to make it clear to Mr. Cook that I did not respond to him because I considered it inappropriate to do so. And I consider it inappropriate for a current or a former minister to speak with a party who is currently suing the state of Victoria. It was not from a lack of sympathy or because I wanted to protect anybody. I'm here to assist the committee to find the truth. I have nothing to hide and no one to protect. Today's hearing comes at a terrible time for our state and for our nation in responding to the pandemic. And I want to send my best wishes to all Victorians. I want to thank also everyone who has reached out to me over the past year. It's much appreciated. Thank you.
Chair, could I just ask something here? We don't have a camera on Ms Mikakos. Why are we proceeding? I mean, it's highly irregular that we would have a hearing of this nature without being able to properly engage with the witness. I don't think this is satisfactory.
Ms Crozier, we have today to conduct this hearing. If you want to stop the hearing,
well, I appreciate
due to the fact that we've got some technical issues at Ms Mikakos's end, her camera's not working. We can't postpone, so we can end it now, or
no,
I would suggest we proceed. And
well, could we understand exactly why the camera's not working? I mean, this is highly irregular. It makes it almost impossible.
I wouldn't say it's irregular for a camera not to work during a Zoom conference.
This hearing, Chair, I mean, this is not the proper process that a public inquiry of this nature should be undertaken.
Ms.
And I find it unsatisfactory.
Ms Mikakos, do you have any idea why your camera is not working?
No, I don't, but I will try.
Have you got a phone?
We can switch to another device. I'm just getting text messages. Sorry, can you hear me still?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
I'm getting text messages from your secretariat. So we did a test run earlier and everything was working fine. I can't offer a solution here.
Could we have a short break, Chair, just while we sort this out?
We'll adjourn for a couple of minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. As I'm sure anyone watching this knows, best laid plans on Zoom. Ms. Mikakos, thank you very much for bearing with us, and thank you for providing us with vision of you. Look, my only question, short question, would be, in light of everything that's happened, do you think that naming I Cook Foods at the time was the right decision?
Look, as I said in my opening statement, and I'm sorry you couldn't see me whilst I made that opening statement, this decision to close I Cook Foods was made by the acting Chief Health Officer at the time, Dr. Brett Sutton. That was his decision. These powers do not sit with the Minister for Health. I want to be really clear about that for those watching at home. They are powers that sit with the Chief Health Officer. So he has clearly sought advice from his colleagues in the public health team and has considered what was appropriate in the circumstances. So it's not for me to comment on the appropriateness or otherwise of what transpired. I was briefed about these issues from time to time, and there was nothing that came to light that raised alarm bells as far as I was concerned. And this is why I expressed the view in my opening statement that, and in my written submission to the committee, that I have no reason to believe that my former departmental officials have acted improperly in this matter.
Thank you. Dr. Q.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms. Mikakos, for assisting us with the inquiry. Just that when you was the minister, would you have been comfortable to allow I Cook Foods or any other entity to continue the production, given that in particular for the case at hand, I Cook Foods provided food for 10 hospitals, 8 Meals on Wheels, council programs, and 2 aged care? Would you be comfortable in allowing that to be continued?
Dr. Q, that would not have been my decision to make. It was Dr. Sutton's decision under the Food Act as to whether there needed to be a closure order issued or there was other steps that needed to be taken. Certainly in the briefings that I recall receiving at the time, and during the course of my time as the Minister for Health, there were very concerning issues that came to light. Clearly, we had the death of an elderly woman, Mrs. Painter, and at the time I respected her and her family's privacy, and she was not named. But there was clearly advice linking her death with this particular business. I know that that's caused a great deal of distress to the Cook family. I understand what it is to have your integrity questioned and the efforts that they have made to clear their name. I can respect that and understand that. But there was nothing that I became aware of that led me to have concerns about the conduct of my officials, or certainly not to have any concerns about anyone acting for an improper purpose or motive.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Crozier.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much, Ms. Mikakos, for being before us. We really do appreciate you doing that and persevering with those issues you've just had. You've just spoken about some briefing papers. I presume you still don't have those. They'll be in the department. That was at the time when you were Minister. Is that the case?
So the only paperwork that I have that relates to this issue are what are called PPQs, and Ms. Lovell would be well aware of those. They are possible parliamentary questions. I'm not sure if I have an accurate or complete set of those. I would suggest that if the committee would like to see those, that they request those from the department. I certainly have no problem at all with those being made available to the committee, and would certainly hope that they are made available to the committee. there will be aspects of those documents that would need to be redacted due to legal privilege. There obviously was a legal proceeding started by iCook Foods. I think it was in the middle of, approximately the middle of last year. And obviously the department's lawyers would have some issues about that information being released. So that's why I'm not proposing volunteering it myself. But I don't have formal briefing papers. You understand those sit with the department.
Okay, we can ask those then.
I would encourage the committee to ask Minister Foley to release those. I've got no problem with them being released.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms Makakos. Can I just go to the issue around Community Chef? As you're aware, I asked a number of questions in the Parliament around the Pitcher Partners report. And in board minutes from Community Chef dated the 15th of April, there is reference to a site visit by Minister Melissa Horne, where she speaks about a future plan strategy for a transition strategy. In fact, it says the minutes go on to state Melissa conveyed that she was prepared to speak to her fellow cabinet member, Jenny Makakos, to encourage her to approve the strategy. In these same minutes, it talks about an $800,000 drawdown of the $1 million loan facility. Can you enlighten the committee on that $800,000 and why it was required, and what the strategy was that Ms Horne was talking about from these board minutes, and what you recall from those discussions you had with her?
Well, firstly, I know this issue came up in last year's hearings, so I've had a quick look at the transcripts in recent days. I don't recall having a conversation with Melissa Horne about this matter. That's not to say that it didn't happen, but I certainly don't recall it. And she's not a person that I spoke to a great deal, despite being a cabinet colleague. So I imagine I would recall if that conversation happened. She's, of course, a local member in the western suburbs, and I can understand why she would have taken an interest in the future viability of Community Chef. As to issues around funding and drawdown, you've just had Greg Stenton, the relevant departmental secretary, appear before you. I think they would be questions best directed to him.
Unfortunately, we didn't get a chance to do that, so I'm just wondering your recollection.
I'm sure, Ms Crozier, you can still make some further requests of the department for any clarification. Look, the point I would make about Community Chef, because there's certainly been some very serious allegations made over the course of the last 2 years about this issue. Look, I want to stress that I've got no information that would suggest that Dr Sutton was in any way influenced in issuing his closure order of iCook Foods by the department's financial support over more than a decade by successive governments, including by the Baillieu government. And both Greg Stenton and Brett Sutton have addressed this issue about a purported link between the two issues today and also last year as well.
I'm sorry, we've run out of time for that. I'll move on to Mr Limbrick.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ms Makakos, for appearing today, and good to see you again. I've probably got lots of questions, but not many related to this particular topic. But one of the things that we're talking about, and the reason that the inquiry was reopened, was around these new emails. And one of the recommendations of the last inquiry was to amend the Food Act and improving the lines of reporting and communication. So, like, do you think that the fact that these emails came out after the fact are some sort of validates that recommendation, and that there are like room for improvement in as was recommended by the inquiry that you witnessed during your time as Health Minister?
Yes. Look, I recall the report last year came out in the midst of the second wave. I recall having a look at the findings and the recommendations and having some discussions with my staff about the report. Look, I wouldn't have any hesitation in supporting a review of the Food Act. I think any piece of legislation that's been around for a long time needs continuous updating. and it needs to be fit for purpose for the modern times. And I know there were some issues raised about a report being issued essentially through email. There was some discussion last year around what was the report and emails being used, and the fact that the Act didn't really acknowledge emails perhaps at the time that the Act had been framed. So I think it's important that legislation be reviewed from time to time, and that would also include the Public Health and Wellbeing Act. You know, we're in the midst of a pandemic. We had issues around the duration of the state of emergency that came up from time to time. You know, it's time for all of these pieces of legislation that have been in existence for some time to be looked at, and they really need to be fit for purpose.
I couldn't agree more. We're actually attempting to amend the Public Health and Wellbeing Act ourselves right now through a private members bill, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good luck with that.
Ms. Vegela.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Ms. Mikakos, for your time today to appear in front of the committee, and also good to see you again. My question to you is, I'm aware that iCook Foods previously made an application for preliminary discovery for documents from the department in the Supreme Court, and these were offered by the department on a confidential basis, but that offer was rejected by iCook Foods. Did the Supreme Court recommend that these documents be provided to iCook Foods subject to confidentiality provisions?
Look, that's my recollection, because this issue came up, I recall, in the Parliament. Look, the department is required to be a model litigant, and when these issues come up from time to time, you know, these are decisions made by departmental lawyers and it's in-house lawyers, and sometimes they use external law firms as well. They're not decisions made by ministers, and certainly I, you know, had no involvement in those types of decisions. But, you know, I would express my frustration that things might have been slow to move on some of these occasions, because I don't believe that the department had anything to hide, and I would expect the department to be cooperating fully with any litigant in any matter, and making sure that the interests of justice are served. So, you know, there's still litigation on foot, as I understand it, in this matter, despite whatever the committee might find. You know, the Cook family still have the opportunity to pursue their claims through a court of law, and they may choose to do so, and good luck to them. But, you know, there's certainly no role for a minister to be interfering in those processes. I would expect that the department was a model litigant, and if they weren't, or they delayed or took too long in responding to any requests made by a court, then I would be disappointed by that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks.
Ms. Lovell.
Thanks very much, and hi, Jenny. Jenny, this morning we heard from Professor Sutton and Dr. Bone that they made the decision to close iCook Foods without having all of the information they could have had at their fingertips. In particular, a report that they had, or an investigation that they requested that the Knox City Council undertake. They didn't have that information when they made the decision. Also, in your opening statement, you made an apology to the Cook family for what they've been through in this saga. Is that an admission that you now doubt the advice that you received from the department and Professor Sutton, it was correct?
Well, firstly, what I did say to the Cook family is I expressed my sympathy to them for their circumstances, and also to the former staff of their business for the stress and anxiety that they have felt. Clearly, it's very deeply felt. And I expressed my apology if there was any offence taken. I know that Mr. Cook referred to that last year in some comments he made in his evidence. He seemed to take offence at some comments I had made in the Parliament, where I essentially was responding to questions I was asked about this matter, and I was conveying the advice that I had been given by my department about what had transpired. I've expressed an opinion today about there's essentially two trains of evidence or allegations that have been made. One is about whether the decision was validly made, and then the other issue is around whether it was made for a proper purpose. And I've expressed an opinion around my view that I have no information to suggest that the decision was made for an improper purpose. I don't believe I can express a view around whether it was validly made if these facts are in contention now. And I think that's for the department to respond to those particular questions. I know that there was some evidence given. I think it's by Mr. Christie. Have I got the name correct?
Yes, Mr. Christie, that's right. Mr. Ray Christie from Knox. Yeah.
The other day around what reports went to the department and when. That was certainly interesting to me to hear his evidence. And that's really for Dr. Sutton as a decision maker to respond to these matters. And I believe he did earlier, as did Dr. Bone.
Thank you. Do you think that the department should issue an apology to the Cook family?
Well, that implies, Ms. Lovell, that the decision that was made improperly or invalidly. I think that's for a court of law to make that determination. I really think that will be for the courts to determine.
Thank you.
And just one last
Ms.
question.
Lovell, I'm sorry, your time has expired.
Thank you. Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you.
Ms. Watt.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to Ms. Makakos for appearing before us today and for your patience with the technology. It's never easy. I just had a question following up from the discussion at the hearing last week about the role of the department and local councils in administering the Food Act 1984 and the Australian New Zealand Food Standards Code. What is your understanding of how the department and local governments work together to ensure that food sold in Victoria is safe for the community?
Thanks for that question. Look, these issues were canvassed in considerable detail last year. I don't think it serves any great purpose to go through that again. Obviously, the two levels of government need to cooperate closely. Mm-hmm. Typically, there's powers set for both local government and the department in the Food Act. It would typically be the council that would be making such a closure order rather than the department. The circumstances why that didn't occur in this case were canvassed at great length last year. I was asked to participate around the so-called new evidence. I didn't believe that there was any additional light that I could add to the new evidence that we've heard this year. But I've indicated my willingness to assist the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Connors. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Ondarchi.
Hello, Ms. Makakos. I'm with you. I think that we need to find the truth, and I also acknowledge that people's integrity need to have been questioned along the journey, and you've expressed that yourself. I think we need to sort that out. In 2020, when you were asked a question by Ms. Crozier in the House relating to this iCook food matter, you said, I have every confidence in Dr. Sutton. Do you still maintain that position?
I would refer, well, look, firstly, what my view is now is really not relevant, given that I'm no longer the minister. But what I would say is I would refer you to my resignation statement, which is pinned to my Twitter account, in which I expressed my disappointment that there were clearly matters that my departmental officials should have briefed me on. This relates to issues around the pandemic response and our state's response. Clearly, when I was referring to departmental officials, I also had Dr. Sutton in mind in that, and there were clearly circumstances where I felt very frustrated and disappointed, but they are not relevant to the matter that we are here to discuss today.
Oh, the only reason I asked that is because it was in relation to a question around iCook Foods, and I just wanted to confirm what your view was of Dr. Sutton at the moment. But given that you mentioned your response on Twitter and your statement, under the Protection of Parliament, we really haven't had a chance to give you a chance to have a say about that after you were unceremoniously dumped by the Premier. Who ultimately decided on private security guards and hotel quarantine?
Mr. Ondarchi, I mean, it's cheeky, but let's stick to the inquiry at hand.
Well, I didn't bring up her statement, her resignation statement.
Mr. Ondarchi, if you'd like to stick to the inquiry at hand.
But she has a chance to set the record straight now and make sure her integrity is no longer questioned.
You're very generous, Mr. Ondarchi.
Ondarchi, what I would say is that this committee, this same committee that you're a member of, had an inquiry late last year into contact tracing and chose not to call me as a witness. There hasn't been any re-examination of issues related to the Coate inquiry either. I'm mindful of the fact that there is currently litigation on foot relating to the state's pandemic response, and it's yet to be resolved. And I do bear that in mind in terms of what I say about these matters. But I'm committed to the people of Victoria knowing the truth in all matters. And I believe that there will come a time where that may be able to occur, whether that's in a court of law or potentially...
You can have it now if you like. You can have it now.
Potentially a federal royal commission, and I would support such a royal commission because I think there is a need for a thorough examination of the entire pandemic response by the federal government, by state governments, not just in terms of hotel quarantine, vaccine rollouts, hospital preparedness, and also to look at, the lessons to be learned for the future, because these pandemics will keep occurring. So I think that needs to occur at some point in the future, and I've seen some federal Labor MPs support that. I know there's been a view about expressed by Jeff Kennett and others. There's clearly some people across the political divide who think these issues need to be looked at more deeply, and I would certainly support those moves and be happy to participate in any such royal commission.
Thank you.
The shame in all this is that...
Mr. Ondarchi, I'm sorry, your time's expired. Mr. Ondarchi, your time has expired. Ms. Vagella.
Thanks, Chair. Ms. Mikakos, one of the principles underpinning the administration of the Public Health and Wellbeing Act 2008 is the precautionary principle, whereby if a public health risk poses a serious threat, lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as a reason for postponing measures to prevent or control the public health risk. Why do you think is it important to protect the public from a public health risk?
Oh, look, the pandemic that we're experiencing at the moment is your case in point of why public health measures need to be put in place to protect Victorians. And I'm proud of the work that I and others did, including members of the public health team and officials in my department, to work to protect Victorians. Clearly, mistakes were made, and they've been made by many jurisdictions across our country, and those lessons need to be learned. That precautionary principle is one, of course, that needs to guide the actions and the advice led by the Chief Health Officer.
So you're saying it is necessary for these powers to be exercised by the Chief Health Officer and authorised officers under the Act?
Well, they're important powers, but they're for him to decide the circumstances in which he exercises them.
Thanks, Ms. Mikakos. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Watt.
Thank you. I've got no further questions. You actually covered off what was my question in your opening remarks, Ms. Mikakos. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Bark.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks so much, Ms. Mikakos, for being with us. I noted your comments just before about your disappointment and your frustration at not being properly briefed by some of your officials through the period of the pandemic when you were the Health Minister. We've heard earlier today from officials in your old department about the fact that they misled us, albeit they say inadvertently, when they met with us on the 24th of June last year. There were two key issues on which we were not told the truth. And again, officials say they told us this inadvertently. Firstly, regarding the fact that we were told iCook Foods was the sole supplier of foods to the hospital, to Knox Hospital. Professor Sutton said that time and time again to our inquiry. That was wrong, and he admitted that today. And secondly, we were told time and time again that all suppliers of foods had been investigated, and it came out in evidence today that, again, that was incorrect. Can you please share with us when you were briefed as Minister about the fact, as admitted by your officials, your former officials earlier today, that they had misled our inquiry?
I don't, to the best of my recollection, I do not recall any advice that my former departmental officials have in any way provided incorrect information to your committee. And I think the allegations that you're making are really for them to respond to.
Well, thank you very much for clearing that up, Ms. Mikakos. As a former official within the Department of Human Services myself, as a former ministerial advisor to the Chief Minister in the Department of Human Services, I find it staggering and utterly unacceptable that the lead minister in the department would not be briefed upon this. And ultimately, of course, this rests upon the shoulders of the Chief Health Officer, who continues to have enormous control over our day-to-day lives. You made some comments in your other evidence about him. Given the fact that you weren't briefed about this incredibly serious matter, you were sent into the Parliament to answer hostile questions from members of the opposition, like me, like Ms. Crozier, about these matters, without full information, indeed without truthful information. Based upon that and your earlier evidence, do you have faith and trust in Brett Sutton as the Chief Health Officer?
Look, I think the issues that you're posing really are relating to the pandemic response now, and I think we're really straying away from dealing with the matters relating to iCook Foods. But what I would say is that there was no information that came to light whilst I was the Minister for Health that had me concerned about the reliability of the advice that I was given in relation to the closure of iCook Foods. Some matters that did not relate to iCook Foods but related to the pandemic response led me to seek reassurances about these issues prior to Dr. Sutton and Dr. Bone appearing before your committee last year. There was a lot of allegations and a lot of issues swirling around in the media, and I sought a very detailed briefing from them to go through these issues because I wanted to be reassured. And I recall receiving that verbal briefing in some detail.
But they didn't tell you, Ms. Mikakos, in that briefing that there were multiple suppliers of food. There were 6. They didn't tell you in that briefing. Is that right?
Look, this briefing was in the midst of many other things going on. I can't recall now the exact precise details of exactly what was discussed, but there was certainly nothing that came to light that would lead me to be concerned that something improper had occurred.
Thank you, Dr. Bark. Dr. Q.
Thank you. In your opening statement and also as a minister, that you did not involve in the day-to-day nor interfere with their operations. So I have no further question to ask. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Q. Thank you. Well, that actually concludes the questions, and that concludes today's hearing. I thank you very much, Ms. Mikakos, for bearing with us and for appearing today.
Point of order, Chair. We had an hour allocated to this. We have only gone 37 minutes.
Mr. Ondarchi, some people did not have questions, including myself.
There could be more questions,
that has brought us to the end.
Can we have one more?
You were all given the times that you had for questions.
But we're still 23 minutes short of our.
We're not 23 minutes short of this inquiry, Mr. Ondarchi, by any means. By any means. We were supposed to conclude at 4 p.m. and it is now 4:15. You are all allocated a certain amount of time for questions. You have all either used that full time. In fact, I've been more generous with that time, or as some members did not use that time, the time has concluded. Thank you. I appreciate all of the members. I appreciate Ms. Mikakos and all of the witnesses that have appeared before us. This concludes the hearing today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good to see you all.